This week we're going to be launching into something new. Over the past several weeks, we've kind of given you an introduction to the course, talked about what government is, gone over some of our history so we can understand where our government is coming from, and then we talked about this all-important idea of federalism. Normally you'd have a test right now, and then we would jump forward to a next section of the course, which is a more complete review of each of the branches of the government. Because of how we're structuring this course, you're just doing those weekly quizzes until the final exam. So we're going to jump right into it, and we are going to start looking more in detail at the first branch of government, the Congress. Now, remember, there is a reason we call this the first branch of government. It's the first branch of government, first off, because it's set up by Article 1 of the Constitution. But why is it Article 1 of the Constitution? Today, when we think about our government, we tend to think about the president as being the leading representative of the government. However, when our country was founded, that was not what was supposed to happen. When our country was initially founded, the idea was that the legislature and the Senate in particular would really be the sort of political rock stars of our country. The Senate was where the greatest minds came together to deal with the issues of the day. The president was more of an administrator. And so that was how the framers wrote the Constitution. That was the idea of the Constitution. It really makes sense when you realize that every other power in government is reliant upon this legislative power. The legislature creates the laws. The executive branch enforces the laws. The judiciary interprets and applies the laws. However, the president doesn't have anything to enforce, and the courts don't have anything to interpret and apply unless the legislature does their job of making it. So the legislature is first. They're the ones positively making something new, putting it out into our system of government. That's how it's supposed to work. Now, of course, in reality, and we'll talk about the growth of power of the president next week, but in reality, of course, the executive branch has taken a whole lot of the powers that were intended for the legislature. And like I said, it's the first branch of Congress. It makes laws, and it's established by the Constitution. Constitution, at the beginning of each of the articles of the Constitution, they have these what are called vesting clauses. They're called vesting clauses because they say the powers, X and X powers, should be vested in, and says what they're vested in. Vested means given to. And so this means that the Constitution is affirmatively giving power over a certain aspect of government to a body, to a person, dependent upon the article. So in this case, it says all legislative powers herein in the Constitution shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. So that tells us a whole lot about what we're looking at here. We're looking at legislative powers, the power to make law. We're looking at the Congress, and the Congress is made up of two groups, a Senate and a House of Representatives. So all of that is very important to keep in mind. So what powers are these legislative powers? Well, they're spelled out to a certain extent, and we talked about some of these earlier, but they're spelled out to a certain extent in Article 1, Section 8. You can look at them there. The big ones, of course, are to regulate interstate commerce, or regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the states. You see is number 3 there. But all of these are important. Declare war, we'll talk about. Establish post offices and post roads is actually become a political issue again, which is quite exciting. So there are a number of issues here. So let's look at some of the key powers, the ones we really want to focus on. First off, lawmaking. This is, when we think about what they do, this is what we think about, right? We think about the ability of the legislature to make new laws. Now, as we talked about in our federalism, the power of the Congress to make laws, the U.S. Congress to make laws, is inherently limited. They can't just make laws for anything. They can only make laws that the Constitution grants them power to make. So under this federalist system, they can regulate interstate commerce and other matters related to interstate matters and international matters. But wholly matters within a state, those are supposed to be left up to the states. But as we talked about, the Interstate Commerce Clause and the Elastic Clause really take those powers and stretch them out. So to a certain extent, the federal ability to make law has been expanded to cover a whole lot of things that people do. Now, this is the Schoolhouse Rock video. This is I'm Just a Bill. Now, normally I play this in class. It is great. It's from a cartoon kids show about education stuff from the 70s. If you haven't seen it, please click on the link. I can't show videos. Normally my course consists of a whole lot of videos and a whole lot of discussion of those videos, but because of the format, because these are being posted on YouTube, I can't actually show you those videos without the potential of my own video getting taken down, which would be bad. So I encourage you, take a break right now, jump onto this link, watch it, and then come back, okay? So take a break. And we're back. For the two of you who actually watched the video, if you haven't, it's a great video. Watch it when you get a chance. But basically, it goes over how a bill becomes a law in a very accessible way, and it focuses on a couple of things we really want to focus on. But for those of you who don't want to watch a video, I have a very complicated flowchart for you. So, as you can see here, the path for a bill to become a law is that it starts in either the House or the Senate. Remember, we have a bicameral legislature, 2 houses. So we have a House and a Senate. We'll talk about the differences in a little while. The first thing that has to happen is the bill has to be introduced. Now, how is a bill introduced? Well, literally, they take it, in the House, you take the bill you want to introduce and you drop it in something called the hopper. It's literally just a little box up at the front where you drop off bills, and then it's picked up by the president of the House, the Speaker of the House, and read so that it goes, it gets referred in and becomes part of the process. And so you can introduce bills. Most bills can be introduced in either the House or the Senate. There is a limitation. Bills for raising money have to begin in the House. The House has what's called the power of the purse, meaning that all matters related to raising money have to come through the House. And that's a historical ideal that the House represents the people most directly. And so since the people are the one the taxes come from, before we can take money away from the people, it really needs to start as sort of their idea. Now, after it's read in, after the bill is introduced, it's then referred to a committee. Now, if you watch the Schoolhouse Rock videos, you saw that most of that video was them waiting outside of a committee, and that's accurate. So when you think about the House, you think about that big room with all those 400 people in it sitting and talking. But there's just no way work can actually get done in that room. So what happens is they have a number of committees, smaller groups within the House with specialization. And we'll talk more about them on the following slides. But the idea is that the bill then goes to one of these smaller groups with a specialization where they can talk about the issue more directly. Within that committee, they'll frequently have subcommittees, even smaller groups with tighter specializations, who will consider that issue. And then once the committee has had a chance to talk about it, to figure out what they want to do, then they will take a vote on it. Do we want this to move forward? Do we want it to stop? Or in most cases, they'll pigeonhole it. Pigeonholing it means they'll take no action on it. When the House does not take action on a bill, the bill dies. Just right there. It's dead now. And that's what happens to most bills. Johnson, the former president, LBJ, referred to committees as where bills go to die. That's something like 90% of all bills that get referred to a committee just never make it out. And if a bill doesn't make it out of committee, then it can't be considered by the legislative body as a whole. So if you look at it, it has all the stop signs along the side. Those are all the places where the bill just dies. So it goes to a committee, maybe to a subcommittee. It gets considered by the committee and subcommittee, maybe. And then this committee or subcommittee vote on if they want it to proceed, and then they report out of the committee to the House as a whole. And at each one of those steps, the bill can just die. The committee can decide not to consider it. The subcommittee can decide not to consider it. The full committee can decide that it's not worth moving on or decide not to take a vote on it. After it gets out of that committee, it goes to, in the House, another committee, the Rules Committee. Now, the Rules Committee, what it does is it has rules for how bills are considered. So it looks at the bill, says what kind of bill is it, and then puts it on the calendar for consideration on a certain day. I don't care that you know the rules of the Rules Committee, but just know that it exists. After it gets through the committee and then goes to the Rules Committee, then it goes to the full House for debate and vote. Now, that's what we normally think of when we think of the legislature. We think of everyone standing in this big room and talking and debating and these great ideas, but you got to realize you're really just seeing the tip of the iceberg, and that's one of the reasons I really like that Schoolhouse Rock video I told you all to watch. One of the reasons I really, really like that is because it shows that most of the issues going on here take place in these committees and in the back rooms, and that's where the deals are really being made. What happens on the floor is normally just for TV. At that point, the House votes yes or no, simple majority, 50% plus one to pass most bills, and then we're done, right? Well, wrong. We have two houses, two branches of our legislature, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And in order for a bill to become a law, it has to pass through both chambers. We call this bicameralism. That's an important word. I don't think it's on the slide, so write that one down. Bicameralism, meaning that it comes through both chambers. For a bill to become a law, it has to pass the House and the Senate. So what happens? Well, you go through all those steps in the House, and then, assuming it passes, you then have to take it over. You can follow the little line, take it all the way over, and you introduce it in the Senate and get it referred to a Senate committee. And then you start over. It goes to a Senate committee. The Senate sends it to a subcommittee. The subcommittee reports it up to the full committee. The full committee takes a vote on it. They don't have a rules committee because they're smaller. We'll talk about how that works. And then the full Senate has to debate and vote on it again. Now, what happens if it passes the House but doesn't pass the Senate? Nothing. It's dead. It's not legislation. It did not satisfy bicameralism. So we can get through all the steps of the House, get sent to the Senate, get sent to a committee, and then the committee doesn't refer it out. The committee pigeonholes it, makes it disappear. And now, even though the bill passed the House, it's completely dead because it didn't pass the Senate. Or maybe it goes through all the subcommittees and committees, goes to the full Senate, and the Senate votes on it and says, no, we don't like it. It's dead. We're done. The bill is dead. It has to pass both. Okay, let's say that you are very fortunate. You have a bill. You manage to get it all the way through the House. Then you manage to get it all the way through the Senate. But at each one of these steps, the House members and the senators can propose changes to the bill. They propose amendments. The committees will mark up the bills and change. They'll say, we're going to give, instead of $1 million, we're going to give $500,000. We're going to include a section that says you have to give money to farmers at the bottom because we want to make sure they vote for us this year. And you can mark up that bill. So it goes through the House and it gets changed from, the $1 million, $500,000 includes farmers, goes to the Senate. The Senate looks at it and says, well, we really think it should be $1 million, so they up it back up to $1 million, and they say it shouldn't just be farmers, it should also be railroad workers, so they add on another section in the bottom. So now the bill has passed through both the House and the Senate, but they're not the same. They're two different bills. So what happens now? Well, like I said, bicameralism requires that the same bill pass through both the House and the Senate. So you now have two bills that are not the same, that have passed through the House and Senate. So the House and Senate will call what's called a conference committee, or if you're a cool kid, you call it a conferee. So you call one of these conference committees. And a conference committee is representatives from the House and representatives from the Senate get together and try to work out the best language. They both said this bill is good, but they disagreed on how much money to give. They disagreed on where the money should go, how it should be administered. So they go to this conference committee and they sit down and they try to work out those differences. Now, if they can work out those differences, great. The bill then goes back to the House for another approval and Senate for another approval, because remember, we have to have the same bill with the same language approved by both. So if they're able to work out their differences, it has to go back to the House, back to the Senate for approval. Now, that's a quicker process. They don't have to go through all the steps, as you can see from the flow chart, but they have to go through and get reapproved, because bicameralism, that word I keep on saying, bicameralism, requires approval of both the House and the Senate. But what happens if, after all of this work, getting through the House, getting through the Senate, it goes to the conference committee, and they can't agree on the amount? What happens if the House keeps on saying, no, only $500,000, the Senate keeps on saying it has to be a full $1,000,000, and they're not able to work out that differences? Well, the bill is dead, because it has to be an identical bill. So the bill is just dead. So all of that hard work was for naught, because you could not get the House and the Senate to actually agree on the bill. Okay, so finally, after all of that really hard work, the House signed off on it, the Senate signed off on it, it's the same bill, we're done, right? Wrong. Because there's one more step. So you have to have bicameralism, and you have to have, and here's another word worth remembering, we call it presentment. The bill then has to be presented to the president. You see, it's the next part on this flow chart, transmitted to the president. In order for a bill to become a law, it has to pass both the House and the Senate with identical language, and then it has to go to the president for his consideration. Now, once it goes to the president, he can either sign it, and it becomes law. He can veto it, and it does not become law unless overridden. We'll talk about vetoes and overrides later. He can wait 10 days if the legislature is in session and it becomes law, or he can wait 10 days if the legislature is not in session, and that's called a pocket veto. And again, we'll talk about these when we talk about the president, but he can wait 10 days, and if the legislature is not in session, the bill does not become law. We call it a pocket veto. So basically, it comes to him, he can either sign it, veto it, or do nothing. But because that was too simple and we wanted to confuse undergraduate students, when the president does nothing, two different things can happen depending on if the legislature's in session or not. So that's a whole lot. Again, I'd recommend watching the Schoolhouse Rock video, because it does a pretty good job of explaining it. You got a little bit more detail from me, but this is important to understand just how many places in this process a bill dies. It helps to explain one of the most fundamental and sometimes frustrating features of our American legislature, which is that so little gets done. Now, this is important to understand, because when we think about the legislature, one of the things that we always talk about is, oh, the legislature's not passing any bills. Well, they're not supposed to pass bills. And I know that sounds strange, but by design, the idea is that the legislature is really slow. They were afraid, the Founding Fathers were afraid when they set up this government, that the federal government, this central government, would take all the power and would become a new tyrant. And so they created a system that is very, very slow, on purpose. Now, there's a story, a classic story. It's called the Senatorial Saucer. So apparently, it may or may not be true, but it's a story commonly used to explain it. So what happened was Jefferson came home from France, and Washington came to eat breakfast with them, and they were having a discussion about the founding of our country. Now, Jefferson thought that having a bicameral legislature was a bad idea. We should have a unicameral legislature, only the House or only the Senate. But no reason to have a bicameral, because it just made things slow. And so they're sitting around eating breakfast, talking, and Jefferson reaches over and he pours coffee from the very hot pot of coffee into his saucer. And Washington asked him, why did you just pour that coffee into your saucer before drinking it? And Jefferson allegedly said, to cool it. My throat is not made of brass. And so Washington responded with, even so, we pour our legislation into the senatorial saucer to cool it. And so what is that saying? I mean, it's sort of an old, weird story, but what is it saying? Well, why do we have a bicameral legislature? According to Washington, at least in this story, according to Washington, it's because we want it to be really slow. We want it to be inefficient. We want it to be that only the most important issues become law. We don't want a bunch of little stupid laws. We only want important central laws. And so we designed a system accordingly. Okay, so we talked about the committees. The committees are fundamentally important to understanding legislation. There are different types of committees. Well, I'll just run through them. Standing committees, joint committees, conference committees, and select committees. Standing committees are open all of the time. These, from session to session, these are the fundamental ideas that have to be considered, like education, things like that. Joint committees are committees that where you have certain issues that need to be considered by the House and the Senate, because while this is the way it works, a lot of the times they will try to introduce legislation at the same time in the House and the Senate. They'll call them companion bills, so that we can make sure we take care of both of these steps at the same time. Joint committees are those where the House and Senate will work together to resolve it. Conference committees, like we talked about, the conferees are at the end to work out the language. Select committees, sometimes an issue will come up that Congress wants to consider temporarily, and so they'll create a select committee, a temporary committee to consider that issue. Now, these committees have a whole lot of power. Sometimes you don't want them to have that bill. Sometimes you have a bill that disappears into a committee. We talked about pigeonholing. So what happens if a bill gets sent to a committee and the committee won't consider it, but the bill is really important and you want it to be considered? Well, if you can get a majority of people in the House to agree with you, you can file what's called a discharge petition and get it pulled back out of that committee. And that's basically a way, because like we said, most bills die in committee. So this is a way to sort of get around that, to make sure that important bills can't just be killed. So here's a list of some of the committees. Some are more important than others, but you can look at them and sort of see there's a number of different committees in here. We'll go over some of the more important ones. So let's talk about committee membership. So you saw there are a bunch of committees. The House is made up of 435 members, so most people only serve on a couple of committees in the House because there's a whole lot of people. The Senate, however, has a different problem. There's only 100 members, and they have to handle all of the issues that the House handles. So that means that they have to serve on a whole lot of committees. They have to wear a whole lot of hats so that they can cover all of the issues that come up in our country. While members can and will request certain committee assignments based upon their knowledge and expertise, it's ultimately up to the leadership which committee assignment you get. And some committees are more valuable than others. They're more important. Foreign relations, judiciary, House Ways and Means, that decides where money goes. These are sort of the high profile. Judiciary determines who becomes judges. That's a lot of power. Foreign relations, that's a stepping stone to getting in the presidential administration, having foreign policy experience. So these kind of bills are more powerful. They're more desirable. There's other bills that are less desirable. And one of the interesting things is one of the main ways people determine what's more and less desirable is actually how much money can you raise from serving on that committee. If you're on a committee that regulates important industries, it's more desirable because those industries are more likely to give you money, which means it's more likely that you're going to win re-election. So that kind of gets to a campaign finance issue, which we'll talk about later, but it is interesting how those work. Okay, in the Senate, they have something called filibuster and hold. So when a bill comes up for debate, in the House of Representatives, they have a lot of formalities. There's a limited amount of time everybody can speak because there's 435 of them. You can't just turn them loose and let them do whatever they want. You have to limit what can be said, how much time they can do it. The Senate, however, only has 100 members, and it's much more collegiate. It's much more supposed to be much more friendly. And so they have the ability to talk about any issue for as long as they want. So once a senator stands up and starts talking, he's allowed to continue talking for as long as he wants to. So that's called a filibuster. A filibuster is just a really long speech, and what will happen is if a bill comes up that the senator disagrees with, at the end of a session, the senator will get up and filibuster. He will talk for a day, for 2 days, until the session ends, taking up all of the time left so that nobody can vote on this bill. That's called filibuster. It's a very powerful and unique tool. The link down there is to a movie called Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. It's about a good guy who gets elected to the Senate. Actually, not elected. He gets appointed to fill a term. And it's an older movie, but there's this great filibuster scene where one of the other major senators from the other senator from his state is a cheat and a liar and put him in there to take advantage of him and to do some graft. And so he stands up and Mr. Smith does a huge filibuster to tell everybody about how horrible things are. And it's a great movie. I think this goes specifically to that clip. So, feel free to click on that and watch it, or even watch the whole movie, because it really is a fun movie. But this filibuster is a wonderful and uniquely American idea. The idea that one person who has a strong enough conscience to stand up against something they view as wrong should be able to stand in the highest house in the land and just shut down the apparatus of government. To just say, we will no longer have legislation passed because this bill is so bad that I am willing to stand up here for 2 days and say how bad it is. Now, what's interesting about filibusters, they don't have to stay on topic. They do have to keep on talking, but they don't have to stay on topic. So normally when they filibuster, they'll start reading from the Bible. I think Ted Cruz, if I remember correctly, a few years ago was filibustering something, and around his children's bedtime, he actually took out some children's storybooks to read them a bedtime story. And it's sort of become a fun game, but it really is a nifty idea. Now, because the idea of filibuster is so strong, and because senators have to be involved in so many other things, they also have something called hold. Hold basically means that if a matter's coming up for debate on the floor, any member can put a hold on it saying, hey, this is very important to me. Come and tell me before you debate it. That's called a hold. You can't debate this issue until you talk to me first. And the idea is basically to tell everyone I have important input. And if you're very much opposed to the bill, it tells everyone that you're considering filibustering it. And so a lot of the times just putting a hold on a bill in the Senate will be enough for the bill to not come up, to be defeated, simply because nobody really wants to deal with a filibuster. So, fun fact of the day. Filibuster is actually an interesting word because it means pirate. It actually came apparently from the word freebooter, which then passed into French and then came back into English as filibuster. And a filibuster referred to pirates, but it most correctly referred to people from the United States who had put together informal bands of armies, basically. Informal, not state-sanctioned armies, and then would head down to Mexico, Central America, to try to take over parts of the government in order to give them to the United States ultimately. And so this idea of a filibuster, it sort of passed in to the Senate as the idea of this rogue senator coming in and sort of taking over the Senate himself. But a fun little word. I like it. Okay, I think that's where we're going to stop to take our first break because that was quite a bit of talking. So go ahead and take a break and we'll be back in a minute.